All right, so now we're going to do a quick tutorial on the ground plane, meaning things other than the trees and the shrubs. There's a couple of ways to look at it. You can see that I've drawn some boxes here. You can do literal details, abstract details, or pattern details. And literal details might have me taking this first box here and drawing some lines on it. And notice I'm not necessarily measuring the lines. You can if you really want to be accurate to scale. You don't want to make them too big or too small. And I might look at that and say, okay, that's a deck. So now I've got a piece of lumber, and we know that they don't always match. So I'm just going to kind of draw some lines in here. And now that looks a lot more like a deck. I can add a little bit more detail simply by putting in a few spots here and there some nails. I can even add some of the grain, and you can see that doesn't take very long, and that gives you deck. And that would be an example of a literal symbol where we're trying to make the symbol look exactly like what it is representing. Pavers are another good one for that, particularly if you're trying to illustrate the pattern that you want with your pavers. A pattern design might be kind of similar to what I did up here, except we're just using the lines. And I'm going to go on the diagonal because I find that a little bit easier to see when I'm using squares, but I'm just simply filling in the bed area or whatever area I'm utilizing with some sort of pattern. That might represent mulch, it might represent a ground cover, it might represent a turf area. It could be any area that's different from the surrounding area. So that would be an example of a pattern. There's lots and lots of different patterns you can utilize. I just happen to utilize lines there. Another one particularly that we see with mulch is a little bit more what we call abstract, and that is simply where you're going to take your pencil, and this is going to be fairly light, and you simply just kind of start drawing in a little squiggly pattern. Notice I'm not really scribbling, I'm still being very deliberate with this, but this would be an example of an abstract pattern, where you're just kind of utilizing something that sort of represents what you're doing. Again, it gives you a bit of a different symbol look and can represent multiple different things. Whereas when you're doing something that's very literal, it obviously represents either the pavers or the lumber or things of that nature. So there's lots and lots of ways we can do this. What you do want to do with a lot of these detail works is make sure that your pencil work stays very light. Again, I'm drawing a little heavier than I might in an actual design so that you can see it. Usually this detail work is some of the lightest lines on your paper. If you're doing, for example, concrete, concrete tends to have gravel and things like that in it, so you can sort of represent that by stippling. When you're stippling, you want to hold your pencil straight up and down and make sure, I'm going to again do this probably a little harder, you can hit the corners. One of the reasons you want to do this up and down is to avoid what I call the comets. So when you hold your pencil like this and you're going really, really fast, your stippling becomes a little easier to see, yes, a heck of a lot faster to do, but you also end up with things like that, where I could see a lot of them in here, where these look more like lines and not like circles like I have up at the top. Now, what I would also do is probably extend a few of these just into the edges. And if you want to add a little bit of more touch, you could draw some of the aggregate in, something along those lines. Doesn't take very long to do, and it looks better, and that can represent concrete. And utilizing the corners is a great way to add some detail without having to do the entire area. So in a very large driveway, you're not going to stipple the entire driveway. You're just going to do some of the corners and maybe a little tiny bit in the center. You can also, try to go zoom out here. You can also use lines, and again, if you're really struggling with straight lines, you might start with a straight edge, but you're definitely going to want to do this freehand eventually, and you can simply do a pattern. You might do this one a little bit further across, a little bit shorter, and then we get a longer again, maybe a few more here. So that's another way that you can do a pattern and prevent you from having to fill in the entire areas, particularly if your stippling is a challenge. You don't want as much in the center, so even if you're going to do the entire area, you might throw 1 or 2 in the center. Something along those lines. I personally prefer the stippling. I think it looks a little bit neater, but the preference is up to you. And if you use the lines, if you have lots and lots of different patterns and you're utilizing different things, you might try different patterns on different areas of your property, especially if you're using all kinds of different things. You can also do cross-hatching, and again, you can kind of combine different things. So go back to that other one. You might cross-hatch that for yet a different pattern. And again, if you are really struggling, and the longer the line is, you'll notice the longer the line is, the less straight I am. You might try something like that. Again, if you're really struggling to draw a straight line, I might recommend that you utilize a straight edge for that, especially as you're working toward getting things together. Pavers. You want to at least represent some of the area in the type of paver that you're utilizing. They don't necessarily have to be exactly accurate to scale, but you definitely want them somewhat accurate. So if I'm going to draw something that's representing pavers on this particular area, we're just going to do a very simple running bond on this one. You can draw all of your horizontal lines on this. And you'll notice I'm trying as best I can to be fairly close to about the same width, but it's not that important that you're exactly accurate measuring your bricks and your pavers all at the same time, making sure that they're exactly to scale. Here's where I would freehand this, just kind of draw some bricks in. I think you get the point. I don't think I necessarily need to draw all of them in. Again, the same thing. You can kind of add some action lines, and that helps give a little bit of the detail on that. Turf you can do in a couple of different ways. I have seen people do some things like this, kind of stars. I personally don't like that because I tend to get sloppy. That's just me. So I tend to prefer more of the X's because I can control that a little bit better. You'll notice that I'm a tad neater. I'm a little bit more deliberate. When I do the stars, that happens to be a little bit messy for me. That is just me personally. Another thing you can do with turf is simply throw in a few dots. And then write, and I don't have a guideline here for let me draw something in there very, very light. And you could do something like that. And that helps with your turf areas. So it kind of identifies those turf areas. You can also use little patterns. So I'm going to start here, and I'm going to do something like that. You'll notice each one is a little bit different. They don't have to be exactly the same, so you can kind of use what I call the little W's. You can do the same thing if you're using kind of these loop-de-loops, and some of them have 2, 3, 4. There's no necessarily a set pattern to them. You can make some a little bit bigger, a little bit larger. You want to try to keep them roughly in a line. You can also do loop-de-loopies. Again, just kind of randomizing the different patterns there. And then the last one, of course, would be, you know, your upside downs. Or you can do more of the abstract thing. And any of those can represent lots of different types of symbols. Our turf, our ground covers, our mulches, those sorts of things, even a gravel if you needed to. So there's lots and lots of ways to identify those sorts of things as part of your ground plane.